أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. أما بعد، اليوم أتكلم لكم في شرح Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence، بداية الفقه المحمدي ليوسف شاخت. فإحنا في باب ألف، the Medanese. So we're on page 22, and bottom paragraph there, A, the Medanese. Malik enjoins that traditions be followed. Tabari, 81. The details of his doctrine show that he harmonizes an old established tradition from the caliph Abu Bakr with the historical traditions from the Prophet. Mudawwana, volume 3, page 7. So here it just says Tabari 81. I'm not sure exactly if he's talking about Tarikh Tabari or Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha. He's just citing Tabari 81. The Egyptian Medanese reproach others immoderately with diverging from traditions from the Prophet, blame them for rejecting them or interpreting them arbitrarily. But Shafi'i adds, they do the same themselves. Ikhtilaf al-Hadith 124. Shafi'i boasts that he has better traditions than the Medanese, and that's treatise number 3, page 53. So treatise number 3 again is Ikhtilaf Malik wa Shafi'i, and it looks like a good number of these treatises are found, I believe, within Kitab al-Umm. And so to continue, but Ibn Wahb collects an imposing array of them on the problem in question. Mudawwana, volume 4, page 28. For Shafi'i, however, the Medanese are not serious in the respect they pay to traditions. He calls them self-professed followers of traditions and says of one of them, he only affected respecting for the traditions in general and then diverged from their meaning. Ikhtilaf al-Hadith 322. Malik and the Medanese in general anticipate Shafi'i's harmonizing interpretation of traditions, both from the Prophet and from companions, but compared with Shafi'i, they use this method sparingly, and they generally seem to make an arbitrary choice between conflicting traditions. Malik sometimes expresses this by the words, I prefer, ahabba ilayya. But Malik's, and this is a footnote, Malik's expression, the best that I have heard, ahsan ma sami'at, does not usually refer to traditions. See below on page 101, note number 1. Whereas Shafi'i professes to follow the traditions from the Prophet and to disregard everything else in all circumstances, the Medanese choose freely among the traditions from the Prophet and from others, and even reject both kinds altogether. Rabi' says explicitly, our doctrine is to authenticate only those traditions that are agreed upon by the people of Medina, to the exclusion of other places. This is treatise number 3, which again is Ikhtilaf Malik wa Shafi'i, page 148 and page 242. So this here is a perfect example of how Schacht, in all of his work here, he's constantly citing Shafi'i pretty much only. So he's trying to come up with ideas of what the Malikis are like, or what the Maliki madhab or followers of Imam Malik is like. This is technically before really the madhab culture, or the institutions of the madhab. So Schacht is basing all of his ideas about the Medinans or Medanese all off of only Schacht. So one guy, one dude's opinion as to who the Medanese are, and Schacht says, okay, this is good enough. And that goes against his own Western historical critical method, ironically, where you need to have lots of people corroborating this evidence, which is opposite to Islamic historiography, where in Islamic historiography, they tend to see human nature as essentially good. People are good by nature. And that's the idea of the fitrah, okay, which is different from Christianity or secularism in the West, where the automatic assumption is somebody is bad by nature. And so the historiography reflects that. So, in Islamic historiography, generally speaking, as long as if someone reports something, as long as you don't have any evidence to prove that they're untrustworthy, they're not adil, they're not inaccurate in their transmissions, they're not like if you can prove that these people never met, in the chain of narration, like those types of things are reasons, generally speaking, a report or a narrator would be excluded in Islamic historiography. So Schacht here is going against the Western critical tradition in a sense. And another part of Islamic historiography is they call it tahqiq. When I studied Islam traditionally with various ulama, they would always say, you need to have tahqiq. And anything you do, have tahqiq, and here they mean verification. And they mean that if you're going to talk about the Malikis, you're going to have to go directly to the Malikis themselves. Go to the Mudawwana, go to the Muwatta or whatever texts from the Malikis, even if they're not contemporaneous with Shafi'i, even if they're a little later, they may report things about the past. Okay, and of course, the further later you go, the more one may have to worry as to whether historically, how accurate these things really be. I mean, they could very well be accurate. They might not be, though, as well, because these are not eyewitness accounts. And here, Schacht doesn't really do that. It's strange because he cites the Muwatta, he cites the Mudawwana, but then he still gives you a very Shafi'iyan point of view. He's not using those sources to look and verify if what Shafi'i is saying about them is true. So it does feel like, in a way, that Yosef Schacht has an ideological axe to grind, because he only uses the Muwatta and Mudawwana to say what he wants them to, like what he personally wants them to say, and not what they actually say. And so he takes everything, dominant from Shafi'i's texts, and does not give the Mudawwana or Muwatta side of things. And if these things don't exist there, you might look at later texts, but he doesn't seem to be concerned with that. He seems to be concerned more with having this kind of opinion or theory first, and then making the sources match that. And that's why when you had, Muhammad Mustafa al-Azami come later, with his refutation of Schacht, he kind of goes into that real deeply, like, if you actually look at these texts, from the early Malikis and others, you'll see that Shafi'i was totally wrong in his characterization of them. Okay, so it's a contentious point here. It's something that you have to keep in mind while reading Schacht, that a lot of the stuff he says, not only the particular facts that he said has been refuted, and it's also, he's been shown that he mistranslated or misunderstood Shafi'i in various places. Even, Ahmed al-Shamsi has shown that in some of his work, in his dissertation and his book Canonization of Islamic Law. But also that, it seems that Schacht kind of had his own axe to grind with it all. So to continue, in the opinion of the Medanese, sound reason and analogy supersede traditions. Treatise number 3, 145a. Malik considers it necessary to justify his doctrine not only by a harmonizing interpretation of traditions, but also by legal and moral reasoning. And he declares himself ignorant of what a particular tradition from the Prophet may mean in view of the practical difficulties of its application. Traditions from the Prophet are often superseded by traditions from the companions, or even disregarded without any apparent reason. They are regularly interpreted in light of traditions from companions on the assumption that the companions knew the Sunnah of the Prophet best. Malik therefore reasons there is no evidence that the Prophet gave the command in question after the Battle of Hunayn. That he gave it then is an established fact which is not disputed, but there is no evidence that he ordered it or acted upon it afterwards. And although Abu Bakr sent out military expeditions, there is no evidence that he did so either, nor did Umar. Tabari 87. And the Medinese interpret a tradition from the Prophet in the light of a judgment of Umar, because Umar would not be unaware of and would not act against the orders of the Prophet. And that's in Ikhtilaf al-Hadith and treatise number 3 and the Muwatta and the Muwatta of Shaybani. So he's got a footnote there. Opinions of companion prevail over what the same companion may relate from the Prophet. We also find traditions from the Prophet minimized or interpreted restrictively without the justification of traditions from companions. On the whole, we can say that the Medinese give preference to traditions from companions over traditions from the Prophet. This attitude, which is reflected in an anecdote on Zuhri and Salih bin Kaysan ibn Sa'd, and here he's got two eyes, so and then a subscript 2, 135, is of course unacceptable to Shafi'i. So here again, someone who's done some major research in this area is Scott Lucas, who I mentioned in one of the previous videos here, where we're reading Schacht. And so Scott Lucas, he looked at a lot of the early hadith collections like Muwatta, Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba, Musannaf Abdur Razak al-San'ani, these different kind of hadith collections that predate As-Sitta As-Sahiha, or the 6 canonical books like Bukhari and Muslim. They tend to focus a lot more on the tabi'un and tabi'in, mainly because this was still the early period, and they very much trusted the tabi'in to be accurate narrators of the sunnah, of the prophetic tradition. They didn't see a particular reason that we have to say an Rasulullah, and bring it all the way back to the Prophet. It was assumed that if a tabi'i narrated it, who was, met all the shurut of being a righteous narrator, then it must be accurate. But that doesn't mean that they did not have prophetic traditions. Of course, they did as well. And later on, as more time passed and you have more, subsequent generations, the Khalaf, if you will, after the Salaf, the Khalaf, especially, and Shafi'i, Shafi'i argued, wait a minute here. We're starting to get a little bit too far away now from the Tabi'een. And we need to make sure that we're accurately, historically documenting traditions from the Prophet Muhammad. So ultimately, hadith criticism is a form of doing history. And, usul hadith is historiography in a sense. They're trying to figure out what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually say. And that's, of course, massively critical to the Islamic tradition. Sunnis and Shi'is agree. Okay. And of course, people are going to disagree in historiography just like any other branch of philosophy. Okay. Historiography is a branch of philosophy. And, everyone is going to disagree as to what's the best way to sift through the hadith. The Mu'tazila had their own way of sifting through hadith. Hanafis had their own way, Malikis their own way, Shafi'is his own way. The Hanbalis had their own way, but it wasn't that much different than Shafi'i. You had the Ahl al-Hadith had their own way, multiple ways maybe amongst the Ahl al-Hadith. They weren't homogenous per se. You had the Zahiri way of doing it, Abu Dawud al-Zahiri, and, there's Sanad that goes all the way up to Ibn Hazm and after, and things like that. This is kind of a big part of the Islamic tradition, and, this is something that is even nowadays hotly debated. My work in tracing the history of the Hanafi madhab has a lot to do with the fact that it's still debated within the Hanafi madhab what's the correct way to do usul al-hadith and to be used for fiqh. What hadith should we base fiqh rulings off of? So to continue here with Yosef Schacht, in his polemics against the Madani's, Shafi'i repeatedly attacks the idea that the practice of the first caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, to whom he sometimes adds Ibn Umar, and even the later Umayyad caliph Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who is technically a successor, Tabi'i, might either confirm or weaken the authority of a tradition from the Prophet, Treatise 3, page 2. We must not conclude from this that the Madani's doctrine was based consciously or to any considerable extent on a group of traditions from the first caliphs as such. So this is something also that was talked about, I believe, by Scott Lucas. So he's got two really good articles on, early hadith collections and the percentage that come from, companions, and the percentage that come from tabi'in, and percentage that, are prophetic hadith. They're overwhelmingly from the tabi'in and tabi'in. And, in the early period there. And, but hadiths that carried huge authority were from the Khulafa Rashidun, like, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman. And Umar bin Abdul Aziz is remembered very highly as being someone who was involved in hadith, whether he himself was a muhaddith. It's definitely known that he commissioned Zuhri to, start collecting and writing down hadiths. So he's highly remembered as kind of somebody pious, especially in the Sunni tradition. So to continue with Schacht, this is already disproved by the contents of treatise number 3, which contains traditions from Abu Bakr only in 63 to 65, and from Uthman in page 89, as opposed to traditions from Umar in 66 through 88, and from Ibn Umar in pages 111 to 147. Shafi'i himself, within the limits which he assigned to traditions from companions, considered the decisions of the first caliphs more authoritative than traditions from other companions, and he forced this concept of the practice of Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, a concept which was narrower than the corresponding idea of the Syrians. And by that I think he means Imam al-Awza'i, on the Madani's as a rationalization of their attitude to traditions from companions, only in order to refute it. In later times, however, the idea took root in the Maliki school. Khattabi, quoted in Zurqani, volume 2, 169, makes the contentious practice of the first three caliphs a criterion for choosing between conflicting traditions. And Ayyub, that's quoted in Zorqani, Volume 1, page 248, gives an argument e silentio from the first caliphs in order to show that a certain tradition from the Prophet does not contain a general ruling, but refers to a personal privilege of his. The two particular authorities of the Medinese among the companions are Umar and Ibn Umar. The role of Umar as a main authority of the Medinese is explicitly stated in many passages in Treatise number 3. For instance, in page 87, you reply, if something is related from Umar, one does not ask why and how, and one does not counter it by interpreting the Quran differently. The doctrine that a decision of Umar ought to prevail over a tradition from the Prophet is expressed in a Medinese tradition which reflects the discussions in the generation before Malik, Shafi'i, Malik, Zuhri, Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Harith bin Nawfal, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, and Dhahhak bin Qais differed in the practice of tamattu' at the pilgrimage. Dhahhak disapproved of it, and Sa'ad blamed him. Dhahhak referred to Umar's prohibition, Sa'ad to the example of the Prophet. Malik prefers the opinion of Dhahhak because Umar would be better informed about the Prophet than Sa'ad. Shafi'i tries to minimize and explain away Umar's order in Treatise number 3, page 39. Ibn Umar is still known to Maqrizi, volume 2, 332, as the main authority of the Medinese. His role appears from numerous polemical passages in Treatise number 3, such as, you neglect the tradition from the Prophet on the strength of an analogy based on the opinion of Ibn Umar, and say, Ibn Umar cannot be ignorant of the doctrine of the Prophet, page 119. We find that you are indignant at the thought of ever differing from Ibn Umar, page 145a. The references in Shafi'i to Umar and Ibn Umar as the main authorities of the Medinese are invariably accompanied by the charge of inconsistency which he levels against them, because they often disagree with their own authorities. We shall have to draw the conclusions from this in Chapter 7, and are concerned for the moment only with establishing the fact that the Medinese, at the time of Malik, thought themselves free to reject traditions from companions. Shafi'i declares that they do so for no good reason. You contradict Ibn Umar and Urwa, a tabi'i. Rabi' replies, but you also hold this opinion. Shafi'i explains, yes, because the Prophet did it, and then Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. Rabi' concludes, so we agree with you. Shafi'i retorts, yes, but without knowing why. Treatise number 3, 119. And again, treatise number 3, Kitab Ikhtilaf Malik wa Shafi'i. This passage incidentally confirms that reference to the practice of the first caliphs is not an argument of the Medinese, but peculiar to Shafi'i. In Shafi'i's time, the Medinese had not yet gained the reputation for a particular interest in traditions with which they were accredited later. In Treatise number 3, 146, Shafi'i charges them with neglecting much of the little that they transmit, and in page 85 he says, if you abandon the tradition from the Prophet on, here Shafi'i mentions a particular case, for the doctrine of Umar, and the doctrine of Umar on, here Shafi'i mentions another case, for that of Ibn Umar and Ibn Umar's doctrine, in countless cases, for your own opinion, your alleged traditional knowledge is only what you think yourselves. Traditions from successors play a considerable part in the doctrine of the Medinese. See the statistics at the beginning of this chapter. I'm not sure what he's referring to there. They are carefully transmitted as relevant and often supersede traditions from companions. For instance, in treatise number 3, 121, where Shafi'i says, if it is permissible to disagree with Ibn Umar on the strength of the opinion of some successor, may then others also disagree with him for the same reason? Or do you forbid others what you allow yourselves? Then you would not be acting fairly, for you might not disregard Ibn Umar on account of some successor and on account of the opinion of your master Malik. And in another case, consider the opinion of Ibn Umar as an argument against the Sunnah, that is, a tradition from the Prophet. The Madinese presume that when the successor Ibn Musayyib gave an opinion, he would not have done so unless it were based on his knowledge of an authority for his doctrine. So Ibn Musayyib, he was a great muhaddith, I believe, of the Tabi'een. So this is from treatise number 3, page 77. But traditions from successors are not followed automatically. The main Madinese authorities in the generation of the successors will be discussed later, below on page 243. So that is the section A on the Madinese. Next will be section B on the Iraqians that we will get to and read. So right now we're on page 27. So next time we will read B, the Iraqians. Thank you much for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.